to inspire us about opportunities and share his perspectives on how we achieve clean water. So please join me in welcoming George Hawkins.
There was two camps that had assembled the last time this debate was being held. One camp was in favor of strong, uniform standards for discharges, deadlines for performance, sanctions if performance was not achieved, and that the requirements for clean water would not have to be proved at each place by site-specific information, but instead would be uniformly applied to particular categories. That's one camp. There was a second camp, very powerful, that wanted to stay with local limits. Every discharge limit had to be connected to a site-specific scientific evaluation, which, if not proven, could then not be implemented. It would start with the work backwards, knowing only what you had in the river forward. These two camps formed. It was 35 years ago. It was somewhat on the basis of partisanship, but ultimately it ended up being on the basis of the Senate versus the House. The battle was the 1972 Clean Water Act. Most of you probably know this. That's an amendment to the Federal Water Pollution Control Act that was passed in 1956. The system that had been put in place, a lot of good theory, was that for any limit to be imposed, you needed to know the quality of the water body, and you had to work backwards to figure out what would be the proper discharge limit for any one of the polluters, connected to what you wanted that water body ultimately to be. To this day, that's tough science. That's what we're doing with TMDLs. That Clean Water Act in 1956 was amended in the 60s, in the 70s, constantly because it wasn't working. Often what happened is, well, we know what we want here. We want this to be an industrial waterway. So we'll allow more pollution to it. Or we're not sure. I can't prove that this particular discharger is discharging a certain amount to this river. That's a problem. So how can I impose that limit if that's the way the law works? That was the Clean Water Act up to 1972. Some of you have heard me tell the story of visiting the Cuyahoga River in 1969. I was a 9-year-old boy. I took a trip from Fairfax Elementary School. It was sunny when I left. When we got down to the Cuyahoga, you come off the heights in Cleveland, Shaker Heights, Cleveland Heights, you go down into the city, you go down a second hill to the Flats. One of the biggest industrial powerhouses in the world was Cleveland. Believe it or not, Cleveland, Ohio. And it was gigantic facilities as far as your eye could see. This was still in the heyday of manufacturing. And the sun had clouded over. The air was heavy and thick. I got off the bus, asked the bus driver what that smell was in the air. The bus driver, I've never forgotten this, some of you heard me tell this story, patted me on the head. My son, that is the sweet smell of success. Because the idea was that we're going to have the things that make this building, the seats you sit in, the cars you came in or go in, or the metro stations, anything that we build, you have to have the industry to build it. And it will have discharges, and it will pollute places like the Cuyahoga River. That was 1969. I walked to look in the river. Do you know what happened in 1969? Most of you probably do. It burned on fire for a week. It wasn't just a little flare-up. It burned for a week. One of 15 fires on the Cuyahoga in the 60s. So what did we say as a people to that? This will not stand. We, it wasn't Democrats, it was not Republicans, it was people that decided we will not put up with waters that burn. And that led to debate in 1972. The two camps were set. The House has a bill that does not have discharge limits in it. That was the camp that only wanted these local limits that were not working. The Senate, under one of the great leaders of this movement, Senator Muskie, had a version that had required discharge limits for industrial discharges. They were in brinksmanship. They passed a bill that had the Senate version, and Nixon vetoed it. It came back to conference, and you know what happened? Both sides won, which is to this day why we have both water quality standards, TMDLs, and bat-based industrial standards in the Clean Water Act. One came from the Senate, one came from the House. But I would say what happened in 1972, there was a tough battle, as there should have been. These are weighty questions. There's a lot of money. There's a lot of industry, which we all take the benefit of. A lot of livelihoods, a lot of jobs, and a lot of the environment at stake. But the people at that time stood up, and they passed a statute that, in my opinion, is probably the most successful, progressive piece of legislation in the last 50 years. We saw a problem, and we fixed it, because we stood up. Now you fast forward to today, because we're back there right now. Right now. By the way, one of the staffers in 1972 on that bill was a gentleman named Oberstar. Of course, we know he's involved now. So what's the battle lines today? We have a question of whether we're going to have discharge limits, controls that are uniform and standard, but now for a different sector. 1972, it was industry. It was wastewater treatment plants. Today, the question is, are we going to do development? Are we going to do agriculture? In the same way, we already have done it with industry. And the battles are exactly the same. The arguments are the same. The positions are the same. Well, if you do this, it's going to cost too much. It's going to raise. We're going to talk, it's even playing field. I don't care if you build a house in Pennsylvania, Maryland, D.C., or anywhere else. You have to have the same standard for water in any of those places. So it's not protecting one over the other. It's not making development cheaper or less cheap, because it's the same requirement. My view is this is one step to a national program. But we cannot allow these decisions to go to the lowest common denominator. Fine, you guys are doing tough in your town? Well, I'll just build in the next town over where they're not. The river doesn't know the difference. We fail if we don't get all towns to that level. So we're back, and it is our time. This is our 1972. This is our time to step up and make sure that these obligations, which will be uniform, will be sensitive, as Will said, support farming. I have been a farmer. I have owned and run farms. I've never been a developer, but I've lived in a house. I've worked in buildings. I love developers. I couldn't function without them. None of us could. But we're going to set a playing field that requires for them to do what we've already done in the sectors of the battle we fought. The reason that the stakes are so high is because if we don't, we will fail. I hate to be that blunt. My organization faces $3 to $4 to $5 billion in expenditures to reduce pollutants from a wastewater discharge plant. You ever want to come visit? Come visit. The largest wastewater treatment plant in the world is just down the way from here. But if we reduce pollutants from wastewater treatment plants to zero, zippo, none, we fail. Because that's not the predominant sector for the pollutants today. Because of the success we've had, because that's not the predominant sector for the pollutants today.